All right, I think we'll begin now. My name is Farzad Tabatabaie. I'll be the moderator for this second panel of today, titled Histories in Context and Futures at Stake. I'll begin by introducing the panelists. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Good. All right. To my left is Dr. Tom Ricks. He's been kind enough to join us from Philadelphia. Am I right? Dr. Ricks has a PhD in history and a minor in Persian studies from the University of Indiana, Bloomington. He has experience, a lot of experience in fact, with the Middle East and Iran and Palestine in particular. Many years ago, he was a volunteer with the Peace Corps. Perhaps that came out less than diplomatically. I apologize for that. But back in the day, he was a volunteer with the Peace Corps in Mashhad and the city of Mahabad. Since then, over the course of several decades, he has repeatedly traveled to the Middle East, once again, in particular, Palestine and Iran. And more recently, his research focuses on the early 20th century history of the Iranian city of Tabriz, particularly its history in the Constitutional Revolution. More particularly still, this research focuses on an American character, a Howard Baskerville, who was a teacher at the time, having recently graduated Princeton, and who committed himself to this revolution and died during the siege of that city as he was trying to smuggle in wheat, a character that I was wholly unfamiliar with. So I very much look forward to that research. To my right is Dr. David McNally from the University of York. He is a longtime activist and scholar, an author of several books. Most recently is one titled Monsters of the Market: Zombies, Vampires, and Global Capitalism, and didn't leave much to the imagination.
And those are just the politicians.
Over the course of his time as a scholar, his focus has been numerous. To name just a few subjects, these include Marxism, theories of practice, racism, and socialist feminism, again, to name but a few. To the right of David, we have Farzad Tabatabaie. He is a labor and socialist activist, an elected member of CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and more specifically still, he is the chair of the CUPE's Ontario division of the International Solidarity Committee. And he joins us today as well. So without further ado, I just want to thank everybody for being here today and open up the floor. I also present them in the order in which they'll speak. So without further ado, I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Ricks.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hey, thank you.
Salam shalom.
As-salam. من با همه شما اینجا خیلی خوشحالم و از دانشجویان تورنتو خیلی سپاسگزارم. وقتی که من از شیطان بزرگستان هستم، یعنی آمریکا, I speak only for myself. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers very much for what they have done, an enormous amount of work. My role today is, in a brief 15 minutes, to be provocative, something I'm always very comfortable with. So I like to provoke students particularly. They don't need much provocation. But we know today we live in a world, a globe, not only in Canada and America, but in the Middle East and Africa, Latin America, which is angry, very very hungry, and very restless. It was said by a great speaker, we live in the best of times and also the worst of times. And indeed there's wisdom with that. I want to start with, since I have such a long history, particularly with the Iranian student movement when I was at Georgetown University, witnessing in DC the splits and counter-splits between various groups, but their unity on the day that the Shah came to Washington, D.C. with Mr. Carter, and both were made to cry because the tear gas got in their eyes. Poor people. There was in 1980, when I was still at Georgetown, I was invited by the Muslim Student Association, the Iran branch, known as the MSA, to participate in a talk in Lafayette Square, directly in front of the White House. They had set up speakers in a big platform, and it was mid-afternoon. As I was making my way to the platform, I was handed a leaflet by one of the Islamic students from Iran. And in it said this is going to be the celebration of the Day of Jerusalem, Ruzi al-Quds, and that they were going to spend time talking about Jerusalem and the Muslim community, forgetting about the very large and active and very important Christian community, and therefore focusing on a fairly narrow religious focus. I tore up the leaflet and walked home. I got no call, they didn't miss me from them, but it was illustrative of the kind of politics in 1980 being talked about in Iran, that when it came to the Palestinians and the Shuba Philistini in the West Bank, the Palestinian people in the West Bank, which was under colonial occupation by the Jordanians, and then a permanent occupation now today by the Israeli military forces, separate completely in law and order from Israel itself. So the little democracy of Israel is never practiced, probably not in Israel, but certainly not in the West Bank. I've gone back and forth to the West Bank continuously. I taught for 2 years at Birzeit University, Jamia Birzeit. I'm very familiar with the student movements, with the workers' movements also in Palestine. And I must say that from the very beginning, the Palestinians have always been a little disappointed that Iran showed a little interest. That is, the government in Palestine. And although there's a prejudice among the Iranian community, both in diaspora as well as in Iran, against the Arab, against the Arab, for various reasons, it's an historic prejudice. There are, of course, Iranians who are deeply grateful and involved in the destruction of the Palestinian society day by day, drop by drop. They also are very conscious of what happens in Iran. But I was also interested in when I was at Georgetown, that whenever there was a talk given by the Iranians, there were very few Palestinians attending. And I asked them, why don't you attend these Confederation students' meetings? Because they always talk about Palestine. The Iranian students do. They talk about Yemen, they talk about Jafar and Vietnam and Southeast Asia. They have a global view. Jahan Bini. Why don't you have a Jahan Bini? And they didn't have a good answer for me. They were very much involved in their own activism within the very narrow borders of a state that is half the size of New Jersey. You may not like New Jersey, but it's half the size. Israel is actually the size of New Jersey. Very insignificant, small but strategic piece of land. And I told him you ought to go to the Iranian meetings because you'll hear so much about Palestine. And I also asked the Iranians, why do you always show up? If there are 100 people, 75 would be Iranian students listening to things on Iran, Palestine. So at least that's contradiction between what the Iranian governments, meaning the Shah, or the Israelis were privileged citizens when they arrived at the airport, the old Merabat airport, to the present regime in Iran, including Rouhani. There has always been this distance with the Palestinians. It's been at the grassroots level where there's been close ties, beginning with the students and with Palestine and Iran. But there are other contradictions that we have today. For example, the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, is sitting down with Netanyahu, talking about no land returning, no return policy for refugees. I fear for the life of Mr. Abbas. I hope he has a life insurance. Because there is nearly universal feeling in Palestine that there has to be compensation or return of some of the land to the displaced people called Palestinian refugees, who number somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 7 million people. It's not a small group. There was also a discussion today, just as we speak, among these two leaders, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PLO, and Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, that there's to be permanent stationing, permanent settlements, permanent colonies in the West Bank, which means permanently no two-state solution, which is batted about as a possibility to this day by Mr. Obama, who is completely clueless about the Palestinian situation, completely. And deep down, a great deal of anger in both the United States and abroad about his neglect. But the permanent establishment of settlements and colonies means a permanent presence of Israeli military. That goes with the colonies. And they are colonies. They call them, some that are closest to Jerusalem, they call them briefcase settlers, because they travel into Jerusalem to work and travel back along highways only settlers can travel on. These are 200 meters wide, not the 100-meter wide usual highway. So it seizes land when they build a highway. But this is only for settlers. No Palestinian can ride on a whole highway in its own land, in their own land. Well, these contradictions are all part of what have been discussed already here in this conference. Within Iran, there are numerous contradictions. For example, I remember clearly riding in taxicabs in 1970s and 1980s in Tehran, probably before you were born, though I was young then, in which cab drivers would whisper their opposition to the Shah, where students would hide books of various writers in their pocket for fear of them being found and discovered. These are short stories books. Khosrow, for example, had always his books hidden. And he wrote, "Why do we sit comfortably under the Bukhari, and yet we walk through the streets with a book of poetry trembling for fear of its discovery?" In the 1970s, that was the case. But in visiting Iran 5 different times since the revolution, the latest was in 2011, but I remember in 2005 that I was again talking to the same cab drivers who, from the moment I got in, they were usually young, former students, generally, well-educated, would be cursing the present regime from the moment I got in to all the way to Tahrir and back. They would not hesitate to curse, curse, curse. Very outspoken. But what a contradiction. So-called liberal Shah was terrifying. The reactionary present regime seems to be free. We should talk about that, if you like, as to why that contradiction exists. It still does exist today. But there's further contradictions in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, for example. We have the state of Qatar, which is broadcast and helped found Al Jazeera, probably one of the most critical news networks in the Persian Gulf area. Outside of Kuwait used to be, but now it's taken over by Al Jazeera. Now an English program on a daily basis in the United States. And Qatar also is a major naval center for the Fifth Fleet, of all things. And they like the Muslim Brotherhood. They support Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Cairo. Their next door neighbors, the United Arab Emirates, despise Ikhwan al-Muslimin and has close relationships with Saudi Arabia, which also is suspicious of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. This is a distance of no more than less than 300 miles between Doha and Dubai and the various Abu Dhabi, for example. So the contradictions abound in the world condition, the political economy today. And I want to focus on these 3 areas with the time that I have, on Iran, the Persian Gulf, and Palestine, all of which exhibit lessons to be learned and issues to be raised and to question. It's important that Iran not be considered only a subject, like the Danishjuyan of yesteryear, concerned about global affairs should be the center, I would hope, of today. And we're inaugurating that world Jahan Dini today, to see things in a larger context, locally and geographically, internationally. In Iran, of course, we have a the various military Islamic governments established, totally involved in huge economic projects, particularly the military in its Bunga. There are many of these foundations that are established. The Pastar have an enormous amount of capital, possessing as much as 60% of some export items and internal consumables. They're deeply involved in not only import-exports, they're also deeply involved in production within. And yet, Iran is suffering, and the suffering is great among people. I remember being in 2011, going down to the old Mujassameh. For those who don't know what Mujassameh, it simply means statue. But it was the Bishta Hashta Mordad statue, which the people never called Bishta Hashta Mordad, the celebration of the overthrow of Mossadegh statue. Had the statue of the Shah there. It was simply called the statue. This is the ordinary people's way of protesting the presence of this great statue. But it had a lot of bookstores around it. And I went to several of the bookstores only to find that there were second, third, fourth editions, old copies, sometimes first copies, of very valuable books in Persian and English, French as well, but mainly in Persian. And I was struck by this, and I asked every time I saw this, I would ask the bookstore owner, why are you selling old books? He said, we bought them from people who can't afford to live anymore. These are intellectuals who are selling their treasures in order to survive another day, in order to pay their rent for another month, in order to buy gas so they can at least take their children to school. Those are things that we don't get in the press, that the Americans don't understand, because we're given by the propaganda of our own press, which is very powerful and very clever, a very distorted view of Iran. That is not the nuclear issues that Iranians face day by day. It's existence, it's oppression, it's increased violations against their human rights, civil and human rights both together. So that's a contradiction that, in fact, we can discuss further and ask, why did that happen? There also is this contradiction about Egypt. Egypt is seen as one of the Arab Spring countries, beginning with Tunisia, which was accidental in a sense. It was completely missed by the press and the specialists. That suddenly a Kardashti fruit seller was in the streets and was beaten by a policewoman. And in that beating, he decided he had no other purpose to live, because that was his whole sustenance, selling fruit in the streets of Tunis. And he burned himself alive, covered himself in gasoline, and conflagrated himself. And that was the spark, the deep anger, the straw that broke the camel's back. But today we now have a military coup occurring, but the United States government and the US press refuses to call it that. This happened in July 3rd, interestingly enough, last year. It's just called a removal, a takeover, but never this word coup. And reporters won't answer to that. They won't tell you why they do that. Also, I should note that on a personal level, I'm a member of a large organization of Iranian specialists and Middle East specialists throughout the United States called MESA, Middle East Studies Association of North America. It includes the Canadian colleagues. The MESA had noted this as well, and many of us in MESA noticed that as of 2001, that's to say 9/11, a switch went on where no academic would be asked to come and be on the radio. I had problems before that nearly every week with the NBC, CBS, ABC. They would, at one stage, parked their van right behind my car and wouldn't let me leave until I talked to them, and I was late for my class that night. We have none of this, and not a word from PBS and NPR, not a word. No telephone calls, would you comment on? They're all retired generals. So the American people don't hear from specialists who know from the grassroots level what's happening in various parts of Iraq, for example, Afghanistan, and Iran, as well as Egypt. But it's a contradiction. Why do we have all these military guys suddenly talking, retired at that too, knowing very little about what they're talking about except the military strategy. The great wonder of American technology, as in that film, Captain Phillips, which is completely a Hollywood fiction of what actually happened and what should have been the story. It was really a story about the Somalis who were forced themselves to become bandits of the sea, and not about the cleverness of Tom Hanks, or better yet, the accuracy of what are in fact America's official killers. They're crime for hire. I'm referring to the famous Navy SEALs, who are given such a high place in American ideas as being so brilliant. You can run but not hide is their policy. We can get you any place in the world. That's nothing to be proud of. Nothing at all. And yet American people applaud it. We know also, of course, I'm going to start to wrap up. I've been told to do so, which I will neglect to do. Let me move to Palestine, because the Palestinian movement is not just Hamas and PLO. It's on-the-ground student-led and woman-led. There are secret societies organized. There is a third intifada, and you can mark the day today that you heard that for the first time. But a third intifada is on its way. There will be no question that the anger is very deep now that Mahmoud Abbas is about to sign an agreement that will make permanently the occupation in the West Bank. It will be a permanent headache. Palestine is a very small place, but it packs a great punch. Like Iran, it has friends. And so we can see that there will be increased violence in the Middle East down the road, not peace as is now being talked about. And I'll end by giving you a vignette. Within 1 week, we had a very interesting contradiction in the United States and in the world. Vice President Joe Biden attended 2 events within a week. The first was Nelson Mandela,
Yes.
a true hero and revolutionary for South Africa, and his death, his funeral. He also attended the death of Palestine, because this next week he sat next to Netanyahu and various peoples of the Israeli cabinet and stood up to speak for 45 minutes in praise of the butcher of Gaza, the butcher of Beirut. I'm talking about Ariel Sharon, who fortunately was in a coma for 8 years. He should have died sooner. I leave you with that. Thank
Why
you.
the hell did they keep him on life support?
I want to begin first by thanking the organizers. Can everyone in the back hear me? Yeah? Okay. I want to thank the organizers and commend them. I think that having this kind of discussion and this kind of conversation among activists from the Iranian community, from the progressive social movements in Toronto and so on, is an extremely important process for all of us. My remarks are going to focus really on the question of power and empire in the world today, and how we understand some of the current configurations in the so-called Middle East and the Middle East and North Africa. And I want to begin there because it seems to me that even left criticism, when it's dealing with global political issues, often falls into the trap of using the same terminology and language, the same concepts as the mainstream, but then just trying to draw different conclusions. And I think that's inadequate for our purposes. If we're going to talk about power in the modern world, then we have to begin by talking about the fact that power is defined by accumulation, by the accumulation of capital. And that has been the case since Britain, the first capitalist power in the world, in the 17th century, established its global domination. Now, this may seem obvious, but it's amazing how frequently this starting point is lost in so many analyses. When we talk about so-called geopolitics, therefore, the geographical organization of power on a world scale, we are first and foremost talking about the structure of global capitalism, where its centers of accumulation are, and where those centers of accumulation are, there we find as well the states that dominate the world politically and militarily because of the economic power on which they rest. The second point I want to make in this regard is that the era of capitalist power is the first era of world power and world history. With the rise of capitalism, we get truly global politics. It's why it's the 20th century that gives us world wars for the first time, and this remains a defining feature of our age. All politics today is global, no matter how local it may seam. The next point, which I think is decisive here, is that it follows that nation states are not the starting point for understanding global power and global politics. Most of so-called geopolitical analysis starts from the relationships among nation states. On the contrary, if what I say is correct, that power today rests on capital and its accumulation, then classes, social classes, who produces the wealth, who appropriates it, who uses their appropriation of wealth to build machineries of power, has to be the starting point. And then nations get mapped into an understanding of a world which is defined much more primarily and much more fundamentally by classes and class relationships. That is, I think, a key point for us. Then when we move to the level of nations, that's where we begin to draw out the uneven, hierarchical, and imperial dimensions of power. Because if it's true that power is defined geographically by where the concentrations of capital are in the world, well, we know that those are enormously unevenly distributed, and therefore that certain nation states and their allies operate as imperial powers within the world system. This is not necessarily about a single nation state. It's often a complex of nation states working with a chain of command. Some are senior partners, some are junior partners within the global structure of imperial power. So that, for instance, Canada operates as a mid-range imperial power within that structure, where it has a certain independence, but not total independence from the US empire. But all of that is extremely important because when it comes then to the question of anti-imperialist politics, it allows us, this analysis, I believe, to avoid a very easy mistake which is often made on the left. Because it follows that anti-imperialist politics means opposition to imperialism as a system. And therefore, it has to be a politics which strengthens those social groups who are oppressed within the structure of world capitalism. It doesn't follow, therefore, that simply to be against an imperialist nation state and its leadership is anti-imperialist. Doesn't necessarily follow. There can be regimes in the world that are in conflict, say, with the United States, and it doesn't make them anti-imperialist. They're only anti-imperialist if their policies and practices are building the popular power of those social groups who have an interest and a capacity to transform the system away from being one of global capitalism. And needless to say, I think that's extremely important for all of our analysis of global politics and imperialism in the Middle East and in the Middle East and North Africa today. This then brings me to a few remarks about some of the changing relationships of imperial power today. Because one of the things we need to remember is that social relationships are always historical, and therefore always historically dynamic and evolving. Too often on the left, it seems to me, we take an analysis that fit the world at a particular historical moment, and we treat it as an unchanging description of the world. So we take an analysis that fit the First World War, for instance, and we assume that in the past 100 years, since 1914, nothing has changed in the way that global power is exercised. And in fact, I want to suggest that the relationship between military, economic, and political domination that is part of imperialism today has been reconfigured in the neoliberal period. And what I mean by that is that economic mechanisms have taken on a renewed power in terms of domination in the neoliberal period. In other words, yes, by all means, military power is always there, and the dominant powers in the world are always willing to resort to it. as necessary, but it is not always their preferred course of action. And where it is possible to use economic mechanisms to subordinate or resubordinate regions of the world, they are quite happy to move in that direction. And I think we need to understand the way in which during the neoliberal period, trade agreements, global financial institutions, and so on have operated as a key front for the establishment of global hegemony and global domination. So that, you know, the analysis which said prior to 1978, American imperial power in the Middle East rested on its client relationships with Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, I think that was correct. But to think that we can only use that framework to understand how things are operating today, I think is inadequate. To be sure, Israel remains front and center. But it's no longer just Saudi Arabia. It's now become the Gulf Cooperation Council, integrated through its own free trade agreements, which are then integrated through free trade agreements with the United States, the European Union, and so on. And then there is the way in which a whole variety of other nation states, through these free trade agreements, have become increasingly integrated into empire. So that I'm thinking particularly of the kinds of agreements that have brought states like Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and so on, so much into the orbit of American and European power, largely through a whole variety of mechanisms, not only the free trade agreements, but the so-called qualified industrial zone agreements. And this is extremely important in terms of something that Tom was talking about, because every one of these qualified industrial zone agreements, which means Egypt, Jordan, whoever, creates a free trade zone with the United States. Every one of these agreements requires free trade between those nation states and Israel. They can only have these deals if a certain amount of the inputs into all of their products are coming from Israel. So that, in other words, there's this very clever mechanism and system by which the Israeli economy, integrated into the US economy, is being moved into a position of ever greater domination regionally as part of this structure. So I emphasize that, and by the way, I still think that the best treatment of all of this, for those of you who are interested, because I'm drawing extensively here on what I consider the really illuminating analysis of Adam Hania in his book Lineages of Revolt, where he traces through these processes of neoliberal imperialism today. All of this, I think, helps us to understand some of the trial directions that are being developed between Iran and the United States today. They are testing, and Rouhani's speech at Davos, at the World Economic Forum this week, was one opportunity for the Islamic Republic of Iran to position itself as open to neoliberal integration, for instance. A very, very important signal being given to the Obama administration in Rouhani's speech, I believe, in Davos earlier this week. With all of that in mind, I really want to just suggest a few things as by way of conclusion in terms of some of the elements that I think have to be essential to building left and popular solidarity against imperialism in the context of the current moment. One of them, obviously, must be opposition to the sanctions against Iran. These are sanctions which punish the Iranian people. That, I think, has to be front and center. Secondly, has to be opposition to all imperial war threats against Iran and its population. To imagine that Iran's nuclear program is going to be singled out when the Israeli nuclear program isn't just a program. They've got a stockpile of weapons is obscene. Thirdly, though, I think opposition to neoliberalism and austerity has to be central to any such solidarity politics. Fourthly, I think that we need to get much more serious, and I know that some of the organizations in the labor movement, and Farid is part of this with CUPE, are very important here. To begin the work of building whatever grassroots connections are possible with social movements here and social movements in Iran and in the Middle East more generally, with workers' organizations, women's organizations, student groups, and so on, to actually begin that process of grassroots solidarity from below, rather than this idea that we simply have to choose what nation state we are defending. And then finally, the point that Tom also finished on, solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for self-determination has to be an integral part of all of that. But it seems to me that those 6 elements, following from the analysis that I was trying to develop, are really indispensable for the kind of work that I think we're talking about today when we talk about the development of new kinds of solidarities in this particular moment of neoliberalism and imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello everyone.
Hello.
Okay, I agree with David. We can move on to the discussion. Okay, I've typed my what I wanted to present because I wasn't sure if I'm going to actually just basically talk about what my key points. I'm just going to read it. Notice that it's about 15 minutes, right? So I'm going to read it. I'm wearing a number of different hats. Generally, for those of you who know me, but here in particular, I'm wearing 3 hats, and I want to briefly talk about each of them. The first one is CUPE. I'm a member of CUPE, Canadian Union of Public Employees, and my own local, grassroots local, but I'm also an elected chair of CUPE Ontario International Solidarity Committee, which is quite an unpaid position. This volunteer position that any member of CUPE can actually run and get involved. And so we do international solidarity around different issues, not just in Iran. We've done lots of work, especially around Palestine, like for instance, Resolution 50, which became actually very controversial around Barcode and divestment. So as part of my, wearing my hat at CUPE, the reason CUPE, both CUPE National and CUPE Ontario endorsed and financially supported this conference, is like a number of reasons. First of all, we're very much aware of what Monk School and the federal government been doing in terms of recruiting very actively within the Iranian community. So there's a strong effort towards organizing within the Iranian community here in Toronto, very large community, especially we see that a lot with the conservatives and liberals. The other part is also we have a resolution last year called Resolution 21, which is exactly mentioning most of the points that David just mentioned. So that resolution, which was actually discussed on the floor with about 1,000 delegates across the province and was supported and adopted by CUPE. So it gives them a mandate to continue supporting this kind of events, which has a number of key elements. One key element is we are supporting the class struggle in Iran against the global capitalism neoliberal agenda. We support the right of workers and social justice movement to organize. We are condemning the continued arrest, persecution, torture, persecution of labor activists in Iran, but also strongly oppose economic sanctions against Iran, because we know very well, and all of us know that the victims of economic sanctions being the working class, ordinary people of Iran, and hasn't affected the regime in any way. And regardless of that, it's an absolutely inhuman policy, and it's been having disastrous impact in the country and created massive, we had huge unemployment, massive unemployment and jobless in Iran throughout the years. But that created the conditions become absolutely unbearable within the last few years. And also any threats of war and militarization of Iran and the region. So these are the key elements of this kind of support. So that QP is providing, we're hoping that other unions and other progressive movement and socialist organizations in Canada also start like having this kind of dialogue around how we could actually support progressive movement in Iran, while at the same time we are also mindful of imperialist policies and also power struggle within Islamic Republic and and U.S. government. So that's one hat. And that's this resolution we have, and I'm encouraging any one of you involved in any student association or with any trade unions to draft and adopt similar resolutions. And we have some of them in our website, which takes me to my next hat. We have it in QP website, but also I'm wearing another hat as one of the organizers of International Alliance in support of workers in Iran. We formed this alliance about 15 years ago, and with a number of labor activists who are in exile, as well as labor activists who are involved in labor movement in different parts of the world. And we very much a similar agenda to basically promote worker-to-worker solidarity. So one might ask, so if you go on our website, you see the number of resolutions that we've been proposing, and we encourage you to actually look into some of them and do follow up on them. So one might ask, why so much emphasis on class, the issue of class and class struggle? Especially when we know that the Islamic regime of Iran been repressing not only just workers, but also absolutely been repressing women. They've been having sexual gender apartheid policies for years. They've been repressing LGBTQ communities. They've been repressing national ethnic minorities. They've been repressing youth and students movement. They've been repressing anyone who's actually not following their agenda, anyone who's challenging them, writers and all that. So why so much emphasis on class and class struggle, at least here in this discussion? One thing that I wanted to emphasize that we know, and the name is very clear, Islamic Republic. But Islamic Republic is not just a religious, fanatic, fundamental government. Islamic Republic of Iran is the capitalist regime of Iran. Basically, it is the ruling regime of the capitalist system of Iran. Is it the most desirable regime? Is it the most favorite regime that the capitalist system, the global capitalist system is looking for? I'm not sure about that, but it's been able to provide the key aspect of, to support and enforce the key aspect of this capitalist order. And I said this capitalist order includes not just the armies and bus servants and all that, it also includes the whole, all different factions of this regime. It also includes international forces as well. IMF, World Bank, even EU and US government. They all are very much interlocked and interconnected into all of this. So one key argument for us is class and class struggle is one key line that can connect many of the social justice movement in Iran. So what I'm going to refer to is as working class social movement, which is a movement that goes beyond just the immediate workplace. Individual workplace, it's a social movement that addressing capitalism and all its components. And capitalism is not just about individual workplace, it's also an ideology. It's also cultural. It's also repressive in different parts of the world towards women's rights in different parts of the world, like in terms of perpetuating poverty in the worst and extreme possible case. So this is this kind of capitalist order that we're actually fighting. So the emphasis on class movement also comes from the fact that this regime is implementing one of the most aggressive neoliberal agenda in the region. IMF, so to you know, IMF and World Bank is actually applauding Islamic Republic in Iran in the past number of years for implementing structural adjustment program and cutbacks to subsidies. Even the economists in their paper, they talk about it. It's very interesting. They say that IMF, whose major funder is US, which is the most powerful capitalist system in the world, been applauding the changes that the Islamic Republic of Iran has been actually implementing in the past number of years. And then it continues to say that Iran has been implementing this neoliberal agenda in a way that other countries in the region envy. So it's so aggressive in terms of, and despite the fact that they know it created such unprecedented level of poverty, such unprecedented level of joblessness and unemployment and underemployment and job insecurity, and also really, I mean, you can see that in some of the slogans that people saying that you are hungry in some of the demonstrations and rallies. Even demonstrations have been sponsored by a so-called workers' house, which is very much a popular of the government. They have no other choice but to show that actually people are working people in Iran, many of them are living way below poverty. The minimum wage is 4 times below poverty. And then also we have 80% of people working in situ contract jobs. And about 66% of people living in poverty. Something between relative and absolute poverty. So, now let me go back to my way. So to wrap it up, and the key points, as I said, bad or good, desirable or not the most desirable, IRI is the ruling regime of the capitalist system in Iran. The current level of struggle against IRI, if it's not able to beat this massive working class social movement, we're not able to lead any fundamental changes to the benefit of all the oppressed groups and working people. And by working class, we need to actually start talking also about what we mean by working class. I'm talking about the working class as a social movement, but also we need to challenge the current image of working class as in Iran, like it's kind of dominant image that's mostly male, mostly industrial, that in terms of, it doesn't reflect the reality of the working class in Iran today, which is a very large number of women. Also, the large number of young generations are involved. But also many are in industrial, many are in the service sector. We also need to also tackle some issues around the whole concept of middle class, the teachers and nurses, and so many of the government employees considered as middle class and not as working class. So we have to do a lot of work. So when I talk about working class, I'm talking social movement, I'm talking about this ever-encompassing, this wide-ranging movement. So despite the current climate, there are also considerable potential for various grassroots, workplace, and political and social organizing in Iran that can help build a stronger and more inclusive and more united movement. We're far from it right now. The current global struggles, especially in the past few years, and also in the Middle East and North Africa, been encouraging, but also been disheartening at the same time. So in many ways, some of it also been disappointing. We need to learn from all of these struggles. For instance, we know that working class played a huge role in Egypt and Tunisia in the struggle the past couple of years, but also we know that they weren't able to sustain many of the gains. So we need to talk about that. So it's not enough that I'm saying that, I'm claiming that working class social movement has to be basically a leading force that's going to interconnect, and it's going to connect all these social justice movements against the global capitalism and Islamic Republic as a capitalist system of Iran. It's not enough to say that we need to also find out how to sustain this struggle and how to sustain our gains. Especially because of the fact that we have one of the least amount of organizing in Iran compared to the Middle East and other parts of the world. Take a look at Colombia, for instance, even Palestine, or Iraq, or Pakistan. They all have more open, like independent labor organizations and social justice groups openly organizing. In Iran, we have a lot fewer, and a few organizations such as transport workers or sugarcane workers organized. We know that they got crushed, and their leaders been expelled. Some are in jail, like including Comrade Reza Shahabi, and that is actually gone through so much torture, and they're not letting them go. And so we have lots of challenges that I'm hoping that we could actually talk about. One key challenge is how to organize. A working class social movement has to be organized. A part of it has to be organized, but a major part of it has to be also organized. If I wanted to finish, there is also there was discussion at a panel, Farsi panel, about like, for instance, green movement and also the reform movement. One thing that I wanted to emphasize that the key question is not even one about reform versus the status quo, or the reformist versus the principalist. Or the key question in one is not even secularism versus a religious state. I think that these are important, especially because our classes right now definitely is going to be also secular. It's going to have some secular elements. But the key component of it is to challenge this regime where it's actually hurting the majority of the population. This is what somewhere around 50 million people who are poor, working poor, unemployed, disadvantaged, live in impoverished neighborhoods. And that's going to be a key struggle. I think that if you're able to connect our movements, what are the movements, which I'm hoping to hear from you, anyone here about the different movements that are involved, connect all of them and build a stronger movement based on egalitarian, but also I would argue for socialist principles as well. Okay, thank you so much.